Welcome to episode number 10 of Conversations for the End. Today's guest is Dr. Kevin Liu. Kevin has a PhD and is Professor of Applied Psychoanalysis and one of the heads of department at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, University of London. He is the former head of the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies and was director of the MA Jungian and Post-Jungian Studies between 2009 and 2022 at the University of Essex. He has served on the executive committee of the International Association for Jungian Studies and is a member of the adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Kevin's publications include articles and chapters on Jung's relationship to the discipline of history, Arnold J. Toynbee's use of analytical psychology, critical assessments of the theory of cultural complexes, sibling relationships in the Chinese-Vietnamese diaspora, Jungian perspectives on graphic novels and popular culture, and therapeutic art-based approaches to archival research. Two of his papers on racial hybridity and archetypal thematic analysis, the latter co-authored with Anne Yeoman and published in 2023, have been awarded the Scholarship Award for Best Article Published in the IJJS. His co-authored book, also with Anne Yeoman, Jung Collected Works, The Basics, was nominated for the 2024 Greta Award for Best Book. This really was a full circle moment for me. As I obviously touch on the podcast, my kind of academic path was around Jungian and post-Jungian studies, and finding Kevin's lectures before I undertook my academic studies was a big factor in me doing that. So it was really nice to have him on the show for episode 10. We've officially reached double digits, so we are well on our way. Really good insights from Kevin about how we can approach research differently, how we can acknowledge the diverse ways in which people can kind of engage with work that go sort of beyond essays and presentations and things like that. There's some interesting thoughts on kind of the democratisation of like Jungian ideas and Jungian therapy, and loads of other great insights. So I really hope you enjoy this episode. Subscribe on YouTube, follow on Instagram and TikTok, leave a comment, engage with this stuff. It's really good to have conversations with those of you who have been commenting. So I hope you enjoy the show. So here we go. Kevin Liu. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much for coming on. I'm really excited about this one. So, you stated that the reasoning for getting into Jung was kind of a personal connection that you think a lot of people feel when they read Jung. You said it felt like Jung was writing about you. And I myself would say that when I read Jung, I kind of had the same thought, and I know from a lot of people who are interested in Jung, they've said similar things. So it seems like you've hit the mark there. What I'm interested in is, obviously, through many years of teaching Carl Jung's work, how has that relationship to Jung changed? The more you've studied him, and the more you've sort of moved through your career from that initial encounter?
That's a really great question. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for having me. I think that connection that many people feel when they read Jung, or more accessible aspects of Jung's thinking, I would say, is that connection, which then speaks to the universality I think Jung was actually wanting to interrogate and to investigate and to kind of articulate, that, regardless of differences, there is a core essence of what it means to be human. And I think that's how he strikes a chord. But I think that also connects with your question about my fluctuating relationship with analytical psychological ideas throughout my entire career. And indeed, I think it has been a bit of a roller coaster because, as you know, where I was situated at the University of Essex and the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies, it's placed within, um, well, it sits very closely with the Department of Sociology within the Faculty of Social Sciences. So, in that regard, there is a lot of positive influence, but also a particular sway, if you will, towards the psychosocial, which I think is fantastic. And something I've had to kind of come to terms with in terms of balancing my own love of history and detail and thinking about, culturally contingent contexts, and this kind of pull towards universality. There is a tension of opposites that kind of happens there. But I think psychosocial studies is an area where those two aspects can sit together in the conversation to allow us to provide or approach things in a more holistic way. So certainly there has always been that pull. Well, are there kind of universal aspects to the, to the human experience? Can we usefully describe it that way? But equally, there are things where, although Jung emphasized the archetypal image and the historical aspect, sometimes you might feel that that's just kind of paying lip service to the true influence or the full impact of what that means in terms of not only your psychology, your upbringing, but again, those kind of hybrid forces, those multiple forces that converge to kind of shape individual identity. So I would say there was definitely a period at Essex where my not that my love of Jung wanes, but it was challenged in many ways, and it was actually closer towards the end of my time at Essex where that kind of passion started reigniting. So, we were discussing a bit earlier the book on the collected works, but also the psychosocial paper kind of brought me back full circle to a certain extent, and I can say a bit more about some of the motivations behind that particular paper. But now being away from Essex and at another institution where I do get to teach Jung in drama and movement therapy, it's almost rediscovering Jung in a whole new light, and a whole new application. So I think that's been very exciting, but also challenging for me as well.
Can you tell me a little bit about that new discovering? What's that like? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the experience with the students because I love being with the students, and I think that's what I miss quite a bit. But when I'm in the room, I'll just give you an example. I was at some presentations delivered by our drama and movement therapy students, and although we had some really great presentations at Essex and really amazing alumni going through that program, I'm actually so proud of some of the people that have come through that program. There was that element of creativity, utilizing the arts, thinking about assessments in different ways as not just presentation and written work, but performance, and how the two can actually merge together. And it's a completely new experience. It's an enlivening experience, and something that I'm still getting used to. But I think as we move forward within a university context, there is certainly something about the multi-faculty institution, how we understand assessment and what we can actually learn from the creative industries and the creative arts in terms of how we assess work. And I think that needs to be integrated a bit more. So before I left Essex, we started a practice as research pathway for PhDs, and I was part of the task and finish group that brought these regulations in. And I was very pleased. I had two amazing students there. who I still stay in touch with. But it seems that we can build on that. We can build on that, and I would say colleagues within that department, and there are some amazing colleagues in there, can start to begin to think about how we engage our students to ignite that creativity and to help everyone rethink and reconceptualize what research actually means.
Yeah, one thing that comes to my mind when I was doing my undergrad before I did my master's, there was a talk on sort of practice-led research, and I know you have I believe you have an interest in graphic novels and comic
Yeah.
books. There's a book called The Flattening, which is a guy, I can't remember his name. He did his PhD as a graphic novel, and it was all about how you can communicate these kind of ideas through the image in a different way, which is obviously very sort of Jung related. And yeah, I think it's interesting and it's admirable because who knows what kind of intuitive, unconscious, creative forces that are being kind of stifled by immediately being sort of pigeonholed into like write a paper or whatever it may be. So
Yeah, because
must
it
be
doesn't tap it. Yeah, sorry for interrupting, but it doesn't tap into the the differences and celebrating that diversity and differences in how we learn and how we actually engage in
mm,
that work and how we can express it most effectively. And I think if we're only pigeonholing students into saying write 5,000 words, or do a presentation, and that kind of counts as your transferable skills, that really doesn't capture the diversity of students and what they actually bring to the table. And I think the more inclusive we can be at that level of developing assessment, then that's the best thing to do. Not to think of diversifying assessment as a tick box exercise, but just saying, well, how can we actually make this more equitable across the board for everyone? And I think you're going to, once we're able to integrate that a bit more, you're going to see just phenomenal work. And if you're thinking about research, I think the whole landscape is already changing as well, in the sense that, usually it was based on intensive studies, books, monographs, articles, and things like that. But, we're already moving more towards thinking about impact. What is the impact of our work on society? How is it being utilized in different conversations across different sectors in terms of influencing policy? And I think there's certainly now a movement towards that. And there is a place for analytical psychology. And I'm actually doing some work with the National Archives and some other colleagues as well. So watch this space, because I've always been someone who moves around quite a bit in terms of my interests, but also just going where the energy is. And it's been difficult sometimes, because sometimes at certain institutions, they're still in that mode of, this is the ref exercise and these are the outputs. But to be a part of institutions that can kind of think of the broader scope and where research is leading is actually really important.
yeah, that sounds great, and I will be watching that space excitedly. So one thing that sort of semi leads to when you talk about the kind of rigidity of perhaps the way things were done. You were on the Third Eye Drops podcast, and you said that when you became a Jungian academic, you decided that it might be possibly useful, or possibly in some sense forced upon you, in the sense that maybe that's what people think you should do, to go into kind of Jungian therapy. And at the time, you said it created an interesting dynamic that you constantly reflect on. And you said, maybe that's a story for another day. Well, Kevin, it is another day, and I would like you to just tell us a little bit about that time in analysis.
So give me a bit more context, 'cause I love doing Third Eye Drops, but can you describe the context a bit more, and I'll try to respond as best I can.
Well, you were saying that you sort of became a Jungian academic, and the general consensus, I guess, if you become a Jungian analyst, is that you must go through a certain amount of therapy sessions.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And so you kind of felt obligated, I guess, to maybe not obligated, because I don't think it would have been all obligation, but I sensed in the way you described it that there was sort of partial obligation and partial interest in doing it. Um,
Yeah.
and you, I guess you did it for a period of time and then stopped. Was there anything that came up in that? I'm not trying to open up the
Yeah.
door to your therapy sessions, but
Sure. Sure.
I'm
Sure.
intrigued on how doing analysis kind of maybe might have changed your relationship to the academic work.
Yeah. I think it deepened it. But deepened it in the way not that I delve deeper and deeper, um, but the realization or challenging of what depth actually means. Right. So it was an interesting dynamic for me personally, being a Jungian academic running probably the flagship Jungian course in the UK and probably in the world, and then going into Jungian analysis. And I think sometimes, for me at least, this is my personal reflection, what I was really mindful of, um, is that I kind of know what a Jungian dream looks like, or I know what a Jungian interpretation looks like, but that in itself can be a defense.
Mm.
So then you might find yourself in a position of playing these very wonderful Jungian interpretive games, and it's something I can go back and reflect on, and still think that it in teaching something that is so based on the relational and the clinical and not being an analyst is a very kind of difficult space to navigate. Andrew Samuels talks about the good enough all rounder, and you find very few of those in the sense that they are both clinicians and academics at the same time. Andrew being a great example, Renos Papadopoulos, Mark Saban. These are the people that come to mind that are able to kind of straddle those positionalities and identities, if you will. So I always probably felt like I was going in as a deficit, not being an analyst myself, but going through or undertaking that analysis at least gives that experience of what it could be. Now, I think probably what I was referring to back in that podcast is that you do end up in this kind of intellectual play of well, how much do I say? Do I say enough that kind of maybe hides what the reality is? But reflecting on it more and more, what I found in the analysis is that I kind of kept to the surface quite a bit. What were the things that were on my mind at that time? It was about family, it was about work, it was about opportunities. And then some people might say, well, that's kind of really on the surface stuff. And Jungian analysis is really about delving deeper into the things underneath it. And I was reflecting on it with a colleague, and they said to me, these are the things I said to them, these are the things I was kind of talking about. And then they replied back, what's to say that isn't depth? What's to say that that isn't deep? And that really kind of gave me pause for a second, because we make these assumptions of what surface level is, or what the surface is and what the depth is. And maybe at that particular time, the depth was in those everyday concerns. And that really kind of changed my perspective a little bit.
Yeah, and I often think that's something as well that maybe I don't want to put this on other people. Actually, I'll say that maybe I would have felt about Jungian work before learning a bit more about it, was that it's all this sort of big dream, esoteric kind of the weird stuff, right?
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
But what I love, there's Susan Rowland in a chapter on personal myth. She talks about the kind of literature idea of repetition with a difference, and it's this kind of how in your life you can kind of spot your personal myth when the archetypal themes kind of re-emerge with kind of a different historical particularity. Jung with his father, then with Freud, and then in some sense with like Philemon, right? Is well this kind of figure. So I think what I always try and say on this podcast is that the kind of enchantment of your personal myth and your personal story is maybe in those everyday sort of quote unquote surface level experiences. It's not necessarily to be found.
I mean, you see a representation of that in Joyce's Ulysses. but also, in some of the work that I was interested in terms of popular culture, it was kind of that same ethos without expressing it, in the sense that, when people think about Jung's distinction between psychological and visionary art, there is that bias towards the visionary art, i.e., the really difficult to ascertain, the things that kind of make you really uncomfortable. And I get that. But equally, with psychological art, the psychology is still in psychological art. It's in popular culture. The psychology is there and we can see it. So I think that also for me really challenges, I guess, the hierarchy sometimes that you find within analytical psychology, and in everyday life as well. The cool kids who are really into the esoteric art. Well, actually, I kind of like my blockbusters, and I kind of like graphic novels, and it's okay to say that and to still be able to articulate and think critically about those things and where the psyche may be finding itself and expressing itself through those mediums.
Yeah, and that is the perfect segue into my next talking point. Really, is you have spoken about the idea of kind of trying to democratize Jungian psychology and therapy, and I've always sort of spoken, I guess, in academic discussions, on the course and with friends, that I thought that, I mean, I guess much like therapy as a whole. But that Jungian psychology was very much what Rob Henderson has this idea called, it's a luxury belief, in a sense, where it has a certain level of privilege requirements, geographical location, financial income,
Sure.
a certain, you could argue, a certain level of education, because Jung's not exactly, the easiest concepts to perhaps unwrap. And as a result of maybe undertaking it, you get a status confirming sort of marker from it,
Yeah.
So ultimately, I want to find the actual, see if I can find the definition of luxury belief. But it's basically that. It's basically, there are certain requirements to it that exclude and marginalize certain people, be it financial, geographical, like I said, and then as a result of doing it, you get a kind of status boost. So you can you think of the sort of wealthy individual that says, oh, the only way to kind of self-develop and individuate is through Jungian therapy, and that sort of puts everyone else down here. Yeah, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that a little bit more, really, like
Yeah.
your interpretation of that.
Yeah, I've got some thoughts about that. Bryony Clark is the person you need to explore more, and we can speak about Bryony. Bryony. So when I mentioned those two PhD students I had, my two last PhDs at Essex were both practice as research PhDs, and Bryony was the first of the two. And Bryony created a game um, based on the concept of active imagination. And part of her work in developing this game, or gamifying active imagination, was to democratize the process, and to it was a larger commentary on therapy itself. Because if you look at active imagination, what does Jung say about it? It's not for the faint of heart. It's for those who are in the latter stages of therapy, and even then, he uses it very selectively. There has to be a strong enough ego, and yes, all those things need to be in play. But as you say, it puts certain kind of boundaries and caveats on things. Certainly, there is a container and a way to kind of explore those ideas while mitigating some of the more potentially dangerous aspects. That Jung rightfully noticed as well. And what Bryony did was she just created this amazing game. And I won't say too much about it, because that's her work, and she's phenomenal, and she's a game developer now, also a amazing artist with an architecture background as well. But we're actually engaged in a project now. I'm not sure if you saw some of the adverts that we put out, but we're working on a Jung gaming and VR project right now, and Bryony is a part of that team, and part of that remit is not just in terms of research and new theoretical insights, being at the leading edge of this area, this very real thing that is going to impact the way we think therapeutically, the way we do therapy, the way we engage with the world. It's here, and we need to kind of meet that to a certain extent. But part of it is to want to reach Gen Z and to reach a different generations. Like, these ideas still resonate. How do we begin to speak a language that can effectively communicate these ideas so that everyone can gain the benefit, the democratizing, right? The benefit of these particular ideas. One thing I will say, um, I was in a presentation with Bryony, with an audience, and she brought up this idea of democratizing therapy, and some of the looks that she got and the questions that she got would just kind of almost reinforce that this is why this work needs to be done. And gaming VR is one way of doing it. There are perhaps a million other ways we can do it, but I think where our energy leads us in that goal, I think it's a very important thing to do. Is therapy still important? Absolutely. And you can think about or sorry, certain institutions come to mind who will offer sliding scales, which I think is a kind of fair way of making therapy more accessible. There are other ways we can think about in terms of community practice, tied to institutions as well. But again, we need to be committed to that, and we need to make sure that to get these projects running, you need to invest without necessarily a return in sight. And I think that's where the difficulty lies, right? Being able to say that we may not see that immediate impact financially, but that immediate impact will be felt. But is it part of our vision and ethos as, let's say, an organization to be doing those things? Is it important to us? And if it is, we do it. But that's difficult given the higher education landscape right now.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important conversations I think we need to be having, really. I am obviously very passionate about this kind of work and Jung's work, and I would want as many people to have access to that as possible. I remember a conversation I had with Roger Brooke once, and I sort of brought this idea up with him, and he goes, he talked about how those closest to Jung kind of talked about this higher form of individuation, and sort of describe what that process was. And he was basically saying that's kind of rubbish. He's like, I know a guy, and I know this is very anecdotal, and I'm sure Roger was obviously aware of that, but he said, I know a guy he's never read any of this stuff, he's never had any therapy, but he's the most open to the world kind of person. And obviously Roger, writing Jung and phenomenology, a lot of his interpretation of Jung and the self is about this sort of openness to the world, and that always sticks with me as well. And I wonder if there's this, I do feel like people, they romanticize Jung as this kind of like highbrow mythical figure, and I think partly that might be to do with the fact that the way his work is written, partly linked to how he himself was influenced by romanticism, right? It's a lot of that is in kind of the ideas of the anima and things like that. And then I think as time moves on, people read that and they're like, oh, this is much more exciting than, say, in the NHS you have the idea of something like the window of tolerance, or different tools you might use to manage your sort of psychology and your well-being. They're not as exciting, and as sort of, they don't paint the picture that Jung's work does. But that doesn't mean it's off limits to people. And I think the more people we can bring it to, the better. So I commend that. Just to check, the VR work, is that with the stuff with Andrew Howe?
Absolutely. Andrew's a big part of that. And we have Rupert Tower from the Society of Analytical Psychology, Bryony, and some other colleagues who are who are part of that work together. And it's been phenomenal. It's been very challenging, because with all things, it was a financial constraint in the first instance. So here we are during COVID, concocting all these amazing ideas. Hey, wouldn't it be great if we did this and if we did this? And it was only after moving to Central where I realized we had the resources to make it happen. So when we were thinking about this, we initially were thinking, oh, can we rent out consoles? What it would mean, what does it mean to then transport it to Essex? And then can we get the computer science people involved? All these things that we were trying to do logistically. And once I arrived at Central, the realization that we have 20 plus headsets, I was like, okay. And it has been really supportive in that regard, in terms of being allowed to use that equipment, leaning on colleagues with expertise in that area to have that first event. And the second event was just run by myself, Andrew, Bryony, and actually was really successful. And I thought the feedback we got from that session was really, really rich. And we're really excited to pull things together. So myself and Andrew and others will be writing this summer, and hopefully something else will be, in the world soon enough. And
that's
the one thing I was going to say though, Chris, like you were talking about this mystical aspect of Jung, and the first inclination in me was to give you a tongue-in-cheek answer. It's like, but I've been to Jung's house, and I've been to Zurich, and there is something about the place that is being personified. So as much as Susan Rowland talks about, Jung's writing and writing the unconscious, absolutely. I also think that it's worth probably thinking about how our sense of place shapes our thinking and our writing as well. Now, do my papers have the feel of me writing in a shed? Maybe. I don't know. But definitely for Jung, there's certainly that sense of there's something more in this environment. And I think sometimes that leaks into the writing itself.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I certainly wouldn't deny it. I think what I consciously... Firstly, let me just say, in terms of the VR, what I would love to do is I would love to have all of you back on. Andrew, I'm going to call him a friend of the show. He was episode number 1. He's a lovely human being. I'd love to have you all back on when it's all in a position where you want to fully talk about it and go over it. Everyone involved that wants to come on, I think that would be fantastic. But yeah, going on to that note about Jung, I totally agree. I think what I do try and consciously do a lot is I kind of de-artify Jung as much as I can. So, I think it's important to acknowledge what you said 100%. It's totally there. But also the fact, that he was a fallible human being who snapped back at people and kind of, cheated on his wife and all that kind of stuff that he probably wanted people to know about him as well. So, and I think those combining elements, I think, are what make reading the text so interesting, Yeah.
And I think in anyone's writing, to think about the intersectionality of our identities and what we bring to the table. And also, again, it's difficult, but, there is such a thing as authorial intention, in the sense that at a particular time, we are expressing that particular time when we write. And there is an intention behind what we're putting out there. Now, there could be arguments that once it leaves the author's hand and it's interacting with an audience, it's no longer what it's supposed to be. And, I can understand that. But equally, there is such a thing of kind of going back and looking at the author. And there was something either personal, or some idea that they latched onto. And if we can investigate that, there is such a thing as the I that's still in the writing. And I do think it's possible to be able to distill that without losing the importance of how in that third space a piece of writing is then changed and shaped by the person who actually reads it, and that conversation that can keep going regarding it long after the author has passed away.
Yeah, I had a similar conversation about art on the last podcast that has not gone out yet. and that kind of feedback loop that takes place, I guess, between sort of history and a piece of work and then the people engaging with it, and then it's just this never ending kind of feedback loop. Yeah, something to think about for me more. So I'm going to pivot.
Sure.
I really want to talk about your paper with Professor Yeoman on psychosocial studies and sort of incorporating Jung into that.
Yeah.
Can you give us a brief lay of the land, a brief overview of that paper?
Yeah. So there's the overview, there's a personal context, and I guess there's also what I would call maybe a career context in terms of where I was and the motivations or the kind of impetus for writing it. I'll start with the personal. Like if I'm thinking about how that paper came into existence, it was a work of repairing and reparation, if you know what I mean.
Say more.
Yes, I will say more. So the idea actually goes back to my PhD, not the PhD I completed, but the initial PhD idea. Now you go back and ask Roderick Main to see if he can dig up that original proposal. I have it. And I dug it out recently when I was actually writing a foreword for a new book that's coming out called Complex and Archetype by Professor James Dillon, who's editing the collection. And there's a lot of great colleagues from the US who've contributed to that volume, in particular Ben Swager as well. And I was looking back at this PhD proposal, and so much of what I wanted to accomplish there that I didn't is manifested in that paper. So it's almost as if it took so long to mourn not doing what you wanted to do. But then for me to reflect and realize, you see, at that time, I had such a big idea in my mind. I didn't yet have the skills and necessary experience to actually pull it off. And this is what you usually find in your PhDs, is that you start with this massive idea, and your supervisors, part of their job is to kind of help you distill it and say, you can't do that in 3 years, but you can do this. And this might be the seed and your ticket of punching your ticket to allow you to do that bigger thing that you actually want to do. And it's quite a humbling experience. I remember cutting tons out of that PhD and saying, I've saved it as a separate file. Maybe I will come back to it one day. And now I'm at the point of, beginning to kind of revisit some of those ideas. But basically in that PhD, it was, as I think I've said in other podcasts and in other contexts, is that, I had two mentors, a historian and a Jungian analyst. And part of that personal context was to bring it together. Now, Tim, who was my mentor, my historian mentor, had this idea about keyhole moments, about using objects or kind of moments in time that may seem insignificant as the doorway to kind of asking larger, bigger questions about the thing that you actually want to describe. What he was describing and looking at was global history, and looking at these interconnections across the world, that, this one little instance happening on, let's say, this small island may seem like it has nothing to do with this larger incident over here. And yet, through a closer examination, patterns begin to emerge. And that's what global history is about in terms of economic trade, in terms of cultural interpenetration. We can find what these patterns are on the surface. So there was always a part of me, it's like, wow, look at these amazing interconnections. What if those patterns were also unconscious as well, right? What if those patterns were psychological and beneath the surface? Now that's very interesting. And it was analytical psychology that gave me that language and that theory of synchronicity to start thinking about what those patterns might look like and how the inner and outer actually are connected, right? Hence this idea of the psychosocial. And it was that kind of interaction between the more historical outer world focus and the inner world focus that was really cultivated by Anne Yeoman that brought those ideas together initially for the PhD. And as I said, what I realized is like what I wanted to do was to link every link several events, put it that way. I wanted to link several historical events to a banning of a book in 1954. That was the big idea in the first instance. It was very difficult to do. Now, through the love of history, through Jung's theory of synchronicity, my kind of subsequent exploration of psychosocial studies, it got to a point where I felt I was able to revisit those ideas, and the framework for that, if you will, were the questions that these amazing students at Essex and elsewhere kept asking me in terms of this idea of an archetype. And they just asked, well, how do you prove an archetype? And you kind of scratch your head, and there are kind of typical responses as to how you might answer that question, i.e., well, we can't know everything. There's an element of unknowing involved that we need to hold on to, and that's important. So that's one way of answering it. You could say that, when Jung was looking at these larger patterns in terms of mythology, how they constellate in culture, in history, etc., that gives us evidence of something called an archetype. And Christian Hessler has done more qualitative studies, if you will, of the efficacy of therapy, of Jungian therapy. So you get that sense of the kind of qualitative and even quantitative methods that he was utilizing. But that still doesn't answer the core question of how do we think critically and rigorously about this idea of an archetype. And that's where, for me, this idea of a more holistic approach began to constellate. So if you think of typology, a lot of what is amazing about Jungian thinking and work is that it's really based on intuition sometimes, right? We have these fantastic interpretations, very creative, very psychological, but sometimes we're missing that grounding. And for me, if we're kind of hitting on intuition and feeling, i.e., this is valuable, we know it's valuable, but then we're not necessarily always grounding it in the thinking and the sensation, i.e., the concrete example. So a part of me was thinking, we're really good at this. To round it off, how do we do a bit of the really difficult legwork? And if we're
Hmm.
kind of constellating or focusing on this question of, well, how do you begin to prove an archetype? For me, it morphed more to not prove an archetype, but to design both a method and methodology that allows us to begin to move closer to saying something has been constellated and we could be calling this an archetype. Now, the reason I call it both method and methodology is that in the paper, there are really clear steps of how we do the work, right? A, B, C, D. So that is the method in and of itself. For me, the methodology is the kind of theoretical tools and assumptions that we're actually bringing to the table. So that thematic analysis is one part of the method, but what is novel about the methodology is that we are being very explicit in terms of the Jungian thinking that is being invested in the project. And we are being very clear that the psychosocial includes the Jungian. And that was a big part of it, that we wanted a voice, if you will, for analytical psychology within this burgeoning field, that there is something important that it can offer. And for me personally, what is really valuable about the Jungian approach is that it's not just about how we collect the data, which is novel and unique, but also how we interpret the data. So it's almost as if I wanted to still do the amazing things that a lot of Jungians are good at, interpreting things, but then to also say, you might think this is really boring, but this is the groundwork we need, right? You can't jump straight to the conclusion without outlining very succinctly and in a particular way how you are justifying this larger interpretation. So if I'm to summarize that, it is both a method and methodology that allows us to rigorously engage in archetypal expressions in the world and beginning to use Jung and to test even Jung's characterizing or description of certain archetypes, so that if we follow this playbook, right, if we use it as a code manual to say, here's the shadow, here are the characteristics he's indicated. Now we look at some things that we might find interesting, and are those things constellated? And do we have proof, if you will, of those things being constellated that correlate back to that code manual? And if we do, again, it's not unproblematic, and we want people to challenge us. We want people to deepen this approach. But if all those things are in place, we can say, yes, something like the shadow has been constellated in this particular instance. And now if I use that data, what does that mean in terms of an interpretation from the perspective of the shadow? And that's what we were trying to do. So I've said quite a bit there, but it's a mix, if you will, of the personal in terms of how I want it to work, in terms of, in almost a very creative way, using objects or instances that people might think, oh, that's a bit weird, or to connect things that don't seem like they want to connect, and to show that there's actually a larger story, maybe an archetypal story that is underpinning all this, that makes things significant. And there's probably a part of me in my upbringing, and hopefully, I can see patterns emerging in terms of our earlier discussion of psychological and visionary art, that things that people want to poo-poo and say, oh, that's not really important. There's a part of me that really just wants to salvage that and say, but actually, hold on a second, maybe it is really important. And there's a way to kind of resuscitate and to give voice to those things that are actually being silenced in the world. So in a nutshell, it's the personal, it's the students who have pushed me to think harder and to come up with these types of things. It's a bit of reparation, but it's also that experience of saying, within the larger field, what are we actually missing in this field? We need something like this. Not to say that there haven't been other iterations like this, but that as a community, we can do better, and we probably do need to do better if we are going to survive in the academy.
Yeah, I think going back to what you said about bringing, I guess, these ideas to a new generation, a younger generation, this paper does do that on one level. It does a lot of things on many levels, and I adore the paper, but it does that on one level because, as I will sort of get you to expand on in a second, the kind of the media, the events that you cover, let's say, in it's 2019, wasn't it? You're looking at the connection of external events and kind of synchronicities to suggest that the archetype of the child has been constellated in the culture. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So go on then to those events. Tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah, so it was the naming of Greta Thunberg as Person of the Year, but also it was an anniversary edition release of the film Akira on DVD. And to me, it just constellated this idea of the child and the significance of, symbolically, well, if these events are happening, what is that telling us about what the community and the culture at large actually desires and needs at this particular moment? And if colleagues here know the film Akira, I mean, it was scary in terms of some of the themes that were almost kind of very synchronistically arising at that time, in terms of the role of the child, the apocalyptic narratives that were arising, in the context of this kind of growing pandemic that was coming. Everything seemed to just connect, and psychologically,
it's set in 2019 as well, isn't it? I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was just so much there that was coming together. It's like, this is what Jung is saying, that, what seems like a coincidence actually is probably by a larger design, if you will, something really psychological that is actually being conveyed, and something that deserves an interpretation. Now, going back to some of the reviewers of the paper, some people weren't convinced it was the year of the child, and that's absolutely fine. But it was at this moment of time in the world that we needed a symbol of hope, but a symbol that also, as any good archetypal imperative would, evoke these very contrary and opposing ideas, feelings, and emotions as well. So as much as the child is there to usher in, a new era, the potentiality of rebirth, there is also that kind of sense of, demonizing the child, but also the apocalypse that comes with it. And what I found really striking was that, in a lot of Greta's speeches, which is what we analyzed quite a bit, there is this apocalyptic sense, like the world is nigh. So what's being constellated there as well is this kind of narrative of the apocalypse that is that is tied so intricately with the notion of the child archetype as well.
Yeah, and the way I thought about it was obviously this idea that the unconscious is compensatory often, and you sort of talk about the state of the world at that point, and I guess at this point in history, there is this kind of what feels like an ecological world ending, or at least humanity ending disaster on the horizon, and all the more reason that this archetype might constellate in the culture. There's a quote, I believe you say, the possibility it points to is one of synthesis and therefore of healing, an anticipation of something evolving towards independence, towards conscious realization. And it is one of hope. And I think what I discovered rereading this today is that you are a glass half full person, and I might be a glass half empty person, because what came to my mind in terms of the idea of the archetype constellating, and please correct me because I may have got this totally wrong, but if that's a compensatory force coming through the unconscious, say, and again we're going away from the data, and I think it's very important that you have that methodology there, but generally speaking then, if that's something that's coming through the culture, would it not be further evidence if we looked at perhaps more mass areas of the culture where that archetypal energy has become repressed or unintegrated, and there would be evidence of that additionally in the culture as well? Perhaps, given the often difficult nature of individuation, that we would see perhaps more of that in elements of the culture. Would that be a reasonable assessment, or am I missing the mark?
Yeah, I think so. It depends again where our personal ideas and passions are drawing us as well. Because I think I'm following what you're saying, is that, you can look for the psychology of the group in certain narratives that might be constellated, and let's say the more kind of accepted larger narratives, if you will, of, let's say, national identity, etc. But I think on the flip side, the compensatory aspect is that there is something that will always grow underground, a resistance, if you will, the underbelly of a culture. But I think what you're saying is that underbelly of the culture is also saying something about the psychology of the group in and of itself. So in that way, there is the kind of larger mythos, if you will, that could be mobilized, which actually, can be mobilized very consciously for political reasons, let's say, but also the kind of reactionary aspects that may come out of that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think what I'm trying to say, and again, I might have got this totally wrong, and if I have, we're doing it live, as they say.
That's it. That's right.
So you talked about these. Was it like keyhole moments, these kind of
Yes,
like,
yes,
so
absolutely, yeah.
and I imagine from what I'm interpreting, these kind of Greta Thunberg, Akira, these
Hmm.
are kind of keyhole moments in a sense. They're kind of these like, I'm just seeing them as these kind of concentrations of archetypal energy that
Hmm.
are then kind of
Yeah,
correlating
yeah,
acausally, right?
yeah.
So what I'm thinking is if that archetypal energy is moving through the culture wholesale, then maybe there are people that cannot be a Greta Thunberg,
Hmm.
cannot. I mean, again, with the Akira thing, it's kind of a more it's outside of a person. So let's use Greta.
Yeah.
So those who can't be Greta Thunberg for whatever reason, perhaps
Hmm.
the archetype might appear in behaviors that are indicators that it is still trying to come through
Yeah.
broader sways of the culture, but it's becoming repressed and unintegrated. So I'll tell you where I went with it. You know, I was
Hmm.
thinking about, if we're talking about this kind of puree archetype, the
Hmm.
child,
Yeah.
right? I was thinking about the provisional life, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
We
Sure.
see that a lot. You look at things like hustle culture, you know, the kind of the grind of young men. I'm trying to bring it to Gen Z, right? We're going on that
Yeah.
theme. This
Yeah.
idea that once I have the Bugatti or once I have X, Y, and Z, I will be fulfilled. And then that's a failure to live in the moment, to see what's in front of you.
Hmm.
An idea I've been playing with a little bit is this idea of digital Don Juanism.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm. Hmm.
Tinder
Hmm.
and the dating apps. It's kind of like Don Juan. It's that you're going through swiping constantly to try and find this mother image. You go on a date, you pour your soul into this person. Once they kind of reveal their fallibility and their humanity, then you know,
Hmm.
unmatch, you ghost them, ghosting in the culture, you know, and then you
Hmm.
move on to the next person. So
Hmm.
I was curious if that was something that, although maybe not touched on in depth, is something that aligns with your thinking around this idea of that specific archetype manifesting. You know,
Yeah.
would we see it in its kind of suppressed
Yeah.
suppressed way?
I would say so. Again, it's how you look and where you find psyche and soul, right? And where you find the psychology. And I think what you're describing here is really about the kind of behaviors of a culture. And within those nooks and crannies of behaviors, the gold of the psychology can be found there. And with Greta, for me, it's like, you're right, we can't all be Greta, but I think it's more about the projections we hang on that person to symbolize, if you will, that sense of both demonizing
Hmm.
the child on one aspect, right? Matter out of place, unruly, challenging what we deem or what we understand a child to be, but also, again, this kind of more perhaps hopeful symbol, right, of the future and of new possibilities. Now, in retrospect, I think certainly that's what we've been hoping for. But as you say, our current situation has merits us to rethink and to revisit that paper in terms of how things have played out and why things have played out in a particular way. But I like your take on it in the sense that, if an archetype is constellated, it may yes, it can be in these kind of keyhole moments. And when you were saying that, I was thinking more and more back to synchronicity. Is that, when a synchronicity actually happens, it's this almost kind of momentary wrinkle in time
Mm.
where you see the true nature of the unconscious and how within the unconscious notions of time and space absolutely collapse. And they're meaningful. These moments are potentially meaningful, two things meeting together, because they just don't seem like they fit. And yet we are able to find these associations and these connections between these things that resonate with us. What I'm hearing from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the child is manifested in other ways as well. And are you saying that in manifesting in these different ways, it is so typical, if you will, of how, well, maybe not typical, but maybe that kind of, I don't know if I want to call it a trickster energy, but just being mindful and um, and thoughtful and appreciative of how the archetypal may find expression in the world.
Yeah, I think that second point is it really. I'm in total agreement with you. I think like I said, I love the paper, and I think
Mhm.
it's what's so great about it is like you were talking about. It takes this intuition idea
Mhm.
that we often carry with sort of
Yeah,
Jungian thinking, and then it
yeah,
does give it kind of a bit of a framework that allows it to be a bit more rigorous in its application, which I think is incredibly useful. And I urge everyone to go and read the paper. And I think what I was thinking is if these causal events that kind of correlate
hmm
are these kind of collapsing of time and geography to these kind of condensed points, then the kind of general behaviors of like the kind of shadow side of the divine child perhaps is those behaviors are more broad brush
yeah,
because they're unintegrated, because they're not fully constellated. It's
hmm
more broad and sort of, I guess, messy in a sense in the general behaviours of a mass of people, as
yeah,
opposed to the potency of Greta Thunberg and
yeah,
her visions of both hope but also disaster and
yeah,
doom,
yeah,
and her energy as a person. Does that make
yeah.
sense?
Yes. And is that a paper that you are well placed to write in the sense of, yeah, in the sense of the poor energy that is being constellated in the behaviors of a particular generation?
I mean, I've considered it, and I did partially touch on it on a paper during my masters where I was talking about um, the the kind of doing a case against the sexual revolution. I was talking about how this archetype appeared in the 60s during the sexual revolution, and it was talked
hmm
a lot about then. And surely, if we are now seeing consequences of the sexual revolution, which we may be seeing in terms of the increased use of pornography, we're seeing the kind of hookup culture, a
hmm
lot of that has come off the back of that time. I asked
hmm
the question to myself, well, then what does the archetype look like now? If again,
hmm
it's kind of these 2 points in time, right?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so I sort of touched on it. Then I did reference your paper in that, and it did all
hmm
right. It did do all right, but I haven't fully, I haven't fully jumped into that task yet. But it is one that maybe I will tackle. I'll have to get your seal of approval on it, I think, before I submit it to any any journals or
I'd
anything.
love to read it. I'd love to read it. And yeah, tell me who marked your paper and we'll have a word.
Yeah, well, it might have been Roderick, so you can. The other thing I wanted to touch on as well when you talked
Yeah.
about your PhD, and one thing that really stuck with me personally is on another podcast. I think it was speaking of Jung
Yeah.
with Laura,
Yeah, sure.
who's lovely.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you came to realize that your PhD is not your magnum opus, and it really
Yeah.
is just the sort of beginning of the work you are going to do. And I think you've expanded on it more in this conversation. But
Yeah.
on a personal level, that was such a beautiful piece of advice that has stuck with me because potentially I will have the same PhD supervisor as you, and yeah,
Mhm.
I'm in that position as well. When you have
Yeah.
big ideas, and I think sometimes trying to accept the
Yeah.
journey in
Yeah.
developing them is a process, and that it's just
Yeah.
at that level maybe it is just the beginning. So,
So I'm going to give a shout out to Father Brendan Callahan of the Society of Jesus because he's the one who said that to me. And that was in the context in showing my own vulnerability is that I actually completed my MA in psychology of religion at Heathrow College, University of London, which sadly is no longer a federal college of the University of London. But he gave me that bit of advice. So he was my MA dissertation supervisor, but he was also the one who gently rejected my PhD application to Heathrow and said, you need to go somewhere else because this is not the place that you want to do it. But in giving that, rejection, it was also care in there and saying, this is a really big idea. It's really ambitious. You need to kind of whittle this down a little bit. And everyone goes through that. And I think for me, writing the Greta paper and writing it with Anne actually was such a kind of full circle gratifying thing. The person who I knocked on her door to help me, to the point where I can then be almost an equal with her, and to kind of write this together. It almost it goes to that fact of Jung saying that, you have to kill the image of Jung in order to be ready to be an analyst to a certain extent. It's that kind of same ethos and energy that, you put your mentors on the pedestal, but one day you have to be able to let that go. And I think it was a great gesture that we could write, several things together, actually. She's, so intelligent, one of the best writers that I know, phenomenal editing skills. And it is not a small thing to say that. People do not know that the gold of writing is in the editing. And Anne is phenomenal at that. And it was this full circle moment that, wow, I started this PhD and I didn't get to say fully what I wanted to say. And it took all that time, all that experience at Essex in various roles and capacities, a global pandemic, having my family. It took all those things to be able to finally to be brave enough to kind of revisit that, almost to say, I'm going to open that wound a little bit. And now's the time for me to get it done, because now I have further knowledge, the skills, and the structure to actually pull it off. But then you're always questioning yourself, is it the right time? And yeah, it's out there in the world. I'm very proud of it. I'm pleased I was able to write with Anne. And it also coincided with kind of an ending of a chapter, which you can appreciate is a big thing for me, because I spent 17 years at Essex. And to finally kind of walk away from that, and to be able to start somewhere new, that paper marked that moment for me as well. So if we're kind of thinking of keyhole moments, that paper will always mark that moment. It's like, these were the things that were left undone. I completed it, and by completing it, I was able to move on. And who knows what what will come afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's there's so many good sort of pieces of advice there. The idea of, if you do suffer some sort of criticism or rejection, or you feel like you cannot bring a big idea forth in a present moment of time,
Yeah.
be patient, cultivate it, continue to live in the world, and follow your curiosity, right? And also, from what you said, do not assign a hierarchy to your curiosity. If you're interested in, be it anime, or maybe you're interested in, something far, far niche, follow it, right? I think
Yeah.
that's the message that you're supporting, and
Yeah.
I think that's really fantastic.
It
Yeah,
won't be easy, and it may make things very difficult, but I'm I with a lot of researchers, there's such a single track, in the sense that things do change and develop throughout careers, but it's usually around a core theme, if you will, or a specialization. And I've been much more eclectic. I've jumped around all over the place. And to be honest, there isn't a particular research strand, although there are things that are developing now for me where I can see, that's where that interest has gone, and that's how that's developed. Um, but I think all those things you said, and plus the role of failure in individuation as well. Where individuation always seems this kind of heroic ideal that we're constantly, on this journey of wonder, awe. But I think sometimes we also forget as well that there are a lot of dark moments in there as well, and failure is a big part of it. And how do we deal with failure, and how do we accept it? And I doubt people want to be in the mood to celebrate their failures, but I think to mark it is really important. So I'll say something else that Anne made me do as she was supporting me through all these various applications for scholarships, because I was at the University of Toronto, where she was a dean. And then I moved on to Heathrow and then Essex after that. And as I was writing all these applications, applying for all these things, she just said to me that every rejection that you have, you need to keep it. You need to put them away, right? And just hold on to them, because one day you'll be able to go back and to look at them and to think about them differently and reflect on the journey that's actually unfolded. So it's almost as if it's a life in rejection letters, which I think is a beautiful idea as well.
Yeah, on the last podcast, I quoted Jung's quote of "men have mythical fates just as much as the Greek heroes do," and then I sort of quipped, but people forget that they think they're going to live their life like a hero, like you say, that path of individuation. But a lot of those heroes died, and I think that's a testament to failure in life. But what you're getting at there is sometimes these failures, these sort of micro deaths, they are often symbolic, and they are often a part of the journey that will, like you say, it all comes full circle. And it enriches life with an even deeper meaning. So I guess nothing is to be wasted. And on the subject of symbolic death, maybe it is doom and gloom with Greta and the constellation of the child archetype. But hopefully, after all symbolic deaths and end of the world, there is a new world of renewal and positivity.
Yes, that's a great point.
I wanted to try and end it on a positive note, Kevin, but thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic. And one final note on it, coming full circle, I did mention before we started recording that a big reason for me going and studying Jung was because of your lectures on YouTube for the Weekend University. I encourage people to go check them out. It made Jung accessible to me, and it gave me that confidence to say, oh, maybe I can do this, because of someone like you being able to convey those ideas in a way that was, like I say, not only accessible but also just in the way that you are, man. It's it's been a pleasure. So this is episode number 10 as well, so I've hit double digits for this project, and I'm glad I could have you on for that. So thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
That's great, Chris. I want to thank you. That's it's important for me to hear these things, and genuinely thank you. So I'm really appreciative. If anyone wants to contact me, I'm at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, and you can find my email on the website. And equally, it's just kevin.lu@cssd.ac.uk. I am very busy, but if you drop me a line, I will do my utmost to get back to you.
Brilliant. Kevin, thanks so much.
Thank you, Chris. Take care.